All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to thank you so much for coming out today. My name is Jarryd Bethea. I am the Senior Research Associate here at the Atlanta Wealth Building Initiative. And firstly, I would like to thank you all for joining us during our first webinar of 2024. We would really like to hope to keep doing these throughout the rest of the year, so please stay tuned. I would like to extend a special thank you and gratitude to those of you on the call who contributed to this project with your stories, your insights and your experiences as we sought to understand the state of Black wealth here in Atlanta. So just a few housekeeping rules before we begin. This will be in the traditional webinar format, so please put any questions you have in the Q&A section of the chat, and we will be able to answer those there. We will have about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the webinar to address any and all questions. This session will also be recorded, so you will have the opportunity to watch it later if you have to leave the call early or there's some pieces you want to make sure that you understood and engage more with the content on the screen. And please also feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and in the comments to react to any information that is presented during today's webinar. So, Building a Beloved Economy, a baseline and framework for Black wealth in Atlanta was written to address the deep disparities that exist between household wealth within Atlanta. This report codifies existing research and data pertaining to the absence of wealth in local communities to offer a guiding star that illuminates opportunities, failures, and successes of efforts designed to bring about economic prosperity here in Atlanta. So, as we all know, the inputs to wealth are not static. They are in fact dynamic. And the reasons that wealth has been amassed by one population versus another cannot be conclusively linked to any one input. And to that end, this report encompasses 9 sections. So we have first in part 1, we go over Black wealth in Atlanta, the current state of it. We look at poverty, income, and Black wealth in Atlanta in part 2. Then we move on to debt and Black Atlantans. Then we move on to access to capital, housing, home ownership, business ownership, jobs and wealth, and other macro factors that impact wealth attainment for Black folks here in Atlanta. And then we conclude our report with recommendations and policy interventions. And so it's also important to note that when you're looking at the data that's going to be presented today, with a few exceptions, most of these statistics will describe the city of Atlanta, so not the metro region. So we're talking specifically kind of what's inside of that 285 loop. And so it's critical that in this discussion, we begin to define Black wealth. So the Atlanta Wealth Building Initiative, AWBI, engages in what is called community-based participatory research, where we orient ourselves and our research in deep collaboration with the communities we're seeking to uplift. Conversations with Atlanta residents left us with the following definitions of Black wealth. And for Black wealth, as we know, it's different for Black people, and the way we experience wealth is different. And so we needed to have a definition that would encompass that and its associated outcomes. And so the typical definition of assets minus liabilities was somewhat insufficient that we began to find in our research. And so if you see here on this image, you'll see that freedom is going to be the word that resonated most with the individuals who participated in our study. Understanding that we then had that definition, we were able to then orient our research in the pursuit of freedom. And you'll see that as we begin to move through the different sections of the report. So in addition to creating a baseline, this report also offers understanding and a new framework for how we confront the massive racial wealth divide and its impact on Black Atlantans, using what we describe as a structural determinants of Black wealth framework. So when we reflected on our own positionality as Black folks in this world, and after listening to other Black people who participated in the study describe their experiences with financial health and wealth, we knew that we would need to guide our research through a new lens, leading to the development of this framework. So it acknowledges the structures affecting Black people today that were built alongside this country when we think about enslavement, colonialism, racial capitalism, and more. So on the right, you'll see a barren tree representative of Black wealth, starved by a dam of structural racism that blocks resources like water that's necessary to grow, as much as the land behind it. But we envision a river that is unblocked, when unblocked and reinforced from human-made structural forces, feeds a nurturing and thriving environment. So that will be kind of the image towards the left. And so the development of policies and programs that promote the complete freedom of Black people to grow and maintain wealth. Those freedoms include freedom from poverty, freedom to access safe and reliable capital, freedom to access asset-creating jobs, freedom from mass incarceration, freedom to live in climate resilient communities, freedom to participate fully in democracy, and freedom to transfer wealth for generations, and which is going to be really important as we begin to talk about some of these statistics. And so you notice the report is also organized to address each one of these freedoms, since the framework served as a roadmap in our analysis. So in order to actually talk about the state of Black wealth here, we are going to have to look closely at key events in Atlanta's history to understand where wealth may have been distributed. By the year 1860, if you look here, you'll see that 2,000 Black people lived in the city, 99% of whom were enslaved. After the Civil War tore Atlanta apart, more free Black folks began to make their way to the city to start a more prosperous life during the Reconstruction era, gaining economic and political progress. Atlanta saw growth in Black banks and Black businesses and political leadership, churches, and more, despite a Reconstruction era that was full of convict leasing, lynching, Black codes, and Jim Crow. But all that progress was stalled during the Atlanta Race Massacre of 1906, where roughly 500 documented lynchings occurred. Federal and urban renewal policies tore through the city of Atlanta's primarily Black neighborhoods, once again stifling the economic progress once more. So when we think about the construction of the downtown connector I-75, I-85, we begin to realize that that construction actually tore through one of the thriving Black business districts here. But still, the resiliency in the city demonstrated with the election of Maynard Jackson as the city's first Black mayor. And here in the year 2024, we've actually ushered in half a century of Atlanta having a Black mayorship. But where are we today? So today, Atlanta is one of the most segregated cities in the US by geography. We can see a clear line of majority Black and majority white neighborhoods in that first graph on your left. Today, the population reflects also a steady decline to 48%, meaning that Atlanta is no longer a majority Black city. While we may still be the largest population here, when we begin to think about a city that has been a beacon for Black middle class, we're seeing that a reversal of historic trends is beginning to indicate that market pressures and the policy environment are making it increasingly difficult for Black families to live in this city. This really begins to reinforce a city of have and have-nots and actively reinforces the racial wealth divide, which we can begin to note is extreme in Atlanta. And so we've talked about this racial wealth divide, and one of the huge pieces of information that this report gives out is today that the wealth of white families is about $238,000, which is 46 times more than it is for Black families, which is roughly $5,100. So in other words, Black folks in Atlanta have just about $2 in wealth for every $100 in wealth that a white person holds. Given the size of the Black population, one might associate Atlanta with significantly greater Black wealth outcomes compared to other large cities and metros, but this is not necessarily the case. And to put it into perspective, this divide is far worse than the national divide average. So nationally, the median wealth for white households is 12.5 times more than it is for Black households. Here in Atlanta, we're seeing a 46 times divide. And so when we begin to talk about wealth, the antithesis of that is often going to be poverty. And so we really want to have this conversation about poverty and income and how it affects Black wealth here in Atlanta. So in Atlanta, children born to families in the bottom fifth of the income ladder have just a 4% chance of moving into a high income category. According to the latest estimates, 28% of Black Atlantans, or more than 1 in 4, live below the federal poverty line. Just as the cumulative effects of wealth accumulation can span across generations, so can multi-generational poverty. And so we have this understanding that 1 in 5 Black people are experiencing poverty for the 3rd generation in a row, compared to just 1 in 100 white Americans. And so while data limitations make it so that we cannot estimate wealth disparities over time at the city level, we can examine, however, the racial income divide over time, as we can see is actually growing. So today, the median household income of white households is $114,000 compared to just about $38,000 for Black households. And despite $38,000 being considered a poverty level household income, this actually represents some growth for the income that's been shared in Black households. However, the difference in median income between white and Black households is still growing. And so we'll see that it's grown from 56,000 to roughly about 74,000 over the past decade, indicating a widening gulf in this economic opportunity that is happening here in Atlanta. And so conventional wisdom will tell us, when we begin to think about this in this debt and Black Atlantan section, is that debt has the potential to help families build wealth, right? But that's not always the case, especially in the Black community. It can be actually harmful to continuously market financial products that are based in debt when we begin to think about that. And so when we think about debt, kind of the other side of that is going to be savings, right? You have debt, you have savings, and it is understood that households that are able to create assets and wealth by incrementally saving some portion of their income. But continuous cycles of delinquent debt make it harder for Black consumers to put aside money. And so in Atlanta, only 37% of Black households have at least $2,000 in savings, compared to 89% of households and 66% of households overall. So we're seeing, once again, a huge disparity in the ways that Black people are able to save in the city of Atlanta. And when we think about debt, and as we talk about that conventional wisdom and understand that debt may be one of the things that allows people to, amass wealth, there's the difference between what makes debt good or bad is ultimately the ability to pay. And so in Atlanta, nearly half of Black residents are in debt delinquency, meaning that they owe a debt that is 60 days or more past due, compared to 21% of white residents when disaggregated by race. And so when we think about this debt, we also really want to talk about in the wealth conversation of the access to capital, so banking and financial institutions. And so access to capital in the report, which is going to be really critical, especially in the thinking of the Black social determinants of wealth, that framework we illuminated earlier, freedom to access safe and reliable capital is going to be really integral here. And so this is important because when we think about Black people, we were once viewed as a form of secure capital for slave owners. So we must be intentional regarding the financial products we offer to the Black community. But first, we must make sure that we are able to develop trust within that community. And so here I have a quote from our community-based participatory research where a community member who lives in Atlanta spoke to us kind of about their understanding and their relationship with accessing capital.
I remember having conversations with my mom and my uncles and aunts, and they talked about how, like back in the day, all of the like black, brown, like us people, they had to deal with credit unions because they weren't allowed to have bank accounts. They couldn't get loans, they couldn't get like any of those things. I remember having conversations with my mom. I remember.
And so we can see here that the resident is talking about how they were accessing credit unions over the idea of going to a traditional financial institution that you may see on the corner. Because when we think about loan rates and loan denials for homes and businesses and just extending lines of capital and credit for individuals, it was much more difficult for us to traditionally get capital at some of those more premier institutions. And so one of the conversations that we have in the report is that there are approximately 37,102 Black Atlantas living in banking deserts. And what that means is that they live in census tracts that contain no bank branches within a 2-mile radius. And so banks are important vehicles for securing home mortgages, securing small business loans, and the access of these capital lending and saving institutions lead Black people to seek alternative offerings of capital, mostly predatory in nature. And so you can see clearly how the census tracts with the larger Black population going to be concentrated on that southwest side of the city are forming a large cluster of a 14 banking desert tract. And so that 14 banking desert cluster is significant when you think about wealth being distributed and accessed in the region. And so in fact, we actually find that nearly half or 48% of Black households in Atlanta are either unbanked or underbanked, compared to the 24% of households within the city. And so we define unbanked as those households without a single member who has a checking or savings account at a bank or credit union. households who are underbanked use financial services and products that exist outside of the traditional banking system. So think something along the lines of quick cash loans. The report then moves into this piece of home ownership, right, and housing. And so home ownership is often recognized as the long-term goalpost for most Americans to strive toward on their journey to build Black wealth or to build wealth in general. Home ownership offers families the needs and comforts of a shelter, but it can also function as an asset that can be used to transfer generational wealth, build equity, and also access alternate forms of capital for economic mobility. But Black people do not always share in those outcomes. And so this slide here goes over a number of facts that were really important and salient here when we're thinking about the home ownership and the housing market as it pertains to Black people and building Black wealth. So the Black home ownership rate is 33.3%, which is trailing behind the city average by 12 percentage points. The existence of this divide not only represents housing instability within the Black community, but it has direct consequences on the financial well-being and wealth building prospects of Black Atlantans. Here are some of the reasons why we personally at the Atlanta Wealth Building Initiative think that wealth building prospects focused narrowly on home ownership are going to be insufficient. So the rate of home loan denials for Black census tracts is almost that of double in other tracts across the city of Atlanta. When we think about Black households making up 48% of the city's total households, but only owning just 17% of the housing wealth. And so the median value of homes in majority white neighborhoods is nearly 3 times higher than the value of identical homes in majority Black neighborhoods. And so we begin to understand that housing assessments and housing valuations can also lead to wealth being stripped out of your home, even though you may have an identical home, but just depending on what side of town it is on and how your neighborhood is populated. And so 2/3 of Black Atlantans are renting their homes is another statistic we found in the report. And we really want to have this conversation because there's a piece of housing wealth that is a predicate to that is having owning your home, correct? But there's also going to be a large renting population. And so in Atlanta, majority Black neighborhoods average 45% of residents classified as cost burden as well. And so cost burden means that you're spending 30% or more of your income on housing. And so when we begin to think about renting and we begin to think about those who are renting and then also cost burden, we realize that there is an even larger hurdle in which we need to jump over for home ownership to actually become a vehicle for amassing wealth. And so now we will discuss business ownership in Atlanta and how it relates to wealth. And so here we have a resident voice.
My family has had businesses in Alabama, and what I found, it's not generation, like one generation does something and we're always starting over. I owned a record store in New York. My son had a printing business in Atlanta, and it just never is enough money. It's never enough money in our businesses, or there's never enough cohesiveness with all our businesses that we work together and grow. My family has had business.
And so what you'll hear from this resident voice here is really beginning to understand that business ownership here is a vehicle towards wealth, right? But in the Black community, we're not seeing that these businesses are able to withstand economic pressures and also prosper and continuously be passed through generations. We're seeing that most business owners feel as though they're starting over and starting from scratch, even if their parents themselves were also entrepreneurs. And so we really wanted to interrogate this understanding of what it looks like for small businesses in the small business landscape to build wealth here in Atlanta. And so when broken down by employer firm or non-employer firm, and so a non-employer firm is going to be a sole proprietorship or not having any employees at all, there's a large difference in the business ownership. So just 3% of the Atlanta area's Black-owned businesses are employer firms, meaning that they have one employee or more, while the vast majority of Black-owned businesses, 97%, operate as non-employer firms with no employees. And so when we begin to understand that businesses are an even greater asset to community wealth building when they have at least one paid employee, we can see that there's a huge disparity here. There's also some disparities that show up when we're talking about annual revenues, right? So annual revenues for Black-owned employer firms are lower than the revenues of others in the Atlanta area. It's important to keep in mind that when we're discussing the revenues of Black-owned businesses, we're not discussing income, but rather the total receipts generated by a business. And so this means that businesses may be profitable by receipts, but not necessarily in their take-home kind of income. And so this is partially explained by the fact that Black-owned businesses are concentrated in lower revenue industries. And so what we'll see visualized in the second chart is that in almost all industries, Black-owned businesses earn even less revenue compared to that of white-owned businesses. And so having that conversation and beginning to do a little bit of that research and analysis to understand what happens for jobs, what happens in the business ownership piece, we really want to begin to talk about jobs, right? Knowing that businesses are greater assets to the community when they're employing an individual, we really want to talk about jobs and understand that how important a job can be for the economic development of Black Atlantans. So in this section, we really wanted to focus on highlighting what we call asset creating jobs and high paying jobs. So those asset creating jobs are going to be the resources that give you healthcare, that are going to be the resources that give you 401ks and things of the like to allow you to live a healthier, more full life. Unfortunately, Atlanta's job creation practices and policies lure development away from their neighborhoods. So this map here shows that 85% of all jobs in Atlanta are located in majority white neighborhood planning units on the city's north side, which severely limits employment opportunities for those residents who live on the south side of Atlanta, which we know are majority Black residents. Moreover, those jobs that pay a stable wage are also concentrated in the Atlanta's north white neighborhoods. And so if we look here, we can see that the number of jobs paying $3,333 or more are going to be once again concentrated on the north side of the city. And so there are a few high paying jobs available in Atlanta and even less available on that the south side of the city. So again, job creation is not necessarily going to be the highest driver of income or wealth attainment if the creation of that job is not one that is fulfilling all around. So earnings from employment, which is different from income, is what makes or breaks the ability of a job to become an asset and wealth creating vehicle for Black people. Despite modest growth in earnings between 2010 and 2022, the median earnings of Black workers trail far behind that of those of white workers. And so we can see that here on this graph is that we'll have around the median white worker is going to be making around anywhere between $46,000 to around $80,000, and the median Black worker is going to be making anywhere between $20,000 to $35,000. And even at the highest end, we're still lower than the median white worker. And so the report begins to move into this section here where we're going to talk about more holistic pieces. And so beginning to talk about this, we understand that the inputs to wealth, like I said earlier, are not static. They're far more dynamic. So what are the things that are enabling us to amass wealth? And what are some of those things that are prohibiting us? They're not always going to be on an economic factor. Sometimes they're going to have social inputs as well. And so this report takes a look at a number of different factors, but one of them, more importantly, is the relationship between arrest and Black Atlantans. And so this is critical, given that the reality that Black people account for an egregious 90% of all arrests made by the Atlanta Police Department, despite making up just only 48% of the city's population. And so when we think about arrests and convictions, they do have a sharp impact on wealth building prospects, wealth building prospects for Black households. In recent research, arrests were found to, no matter what the wealth outcome, even in arrests, the convictions were associated with wealth declines. And so wealth can be reduced to little or nothing while in jail or prison. When we're thinking about those high fees, we're thinking about someone who's out of work for a while and using their savings. We even think about the family members who are going to go into debt, trying to just bail that loved one out. We begin to realize how that wanes and disintegrates the ability for a Black person to amass wealth. We also wanted to bridge the wealth and climate conversations. When we begin to think about climate, particularly here in the Southeast, heat is rising. And so across Atlanta, substandard housing can lead to poor health outcomes for households. And the cost to maintain and keep that housing safe and cooled can be far more significant for those lower income households. And so a recent study of rising heat in Atlanta's neighborhoods found that 30% of houses in Atlanta's historically Black Pittsburgh neighborhood lack central heating and air cooling systems. And in fact, most neighborhoods that were found to have the highest heat vulnerability are in majority Black neighborhoods. And so we know that extreme heat is also linked to higher utility costs. So it may cost households more money to keep their air conditioning running. But what we're finding is that Black households are bearing the largest brunt of that issue and those costs. And so at 9.5%, Black households in Atlanta experience double the energy burden of the average household, which is 4.7%. And so when we have that conversation, we begin to understand how even some of these small things as paying a heat and air conditioning bill, a light bill, is beginning to then deteriorate wealth building prospects and the ability for individuals to save and have that wealth. And so facing our future, Atlanta's current economic policies have not supported opportunities for all people to thrive, right? And so amid these public health crises, economic and racial injustice, state and local policy tools and budgetary decisions have consistently failed to Black Atlantans who bear the brunt of the racial wealth divide. And so we must look at innovative strategies to reduce the racial wealth divide. Policymakers must take up a renewed and bold commitment to counteract these efforts, but working alongside Black residents to craft data-informed solutions that seek to address past harms and build Black wealth. And so this report that we've published here gives 18 recommendations for building Black wealth, but for the digestion of this webinar, we bucketed them into 4 categories. And so once again, we'll hear from a resident voice when we're talking about what it looks like to build Black wealth.
We need help on building wealth. We really do. And that's something that we should have had. We need.
And so really this call from a resident voice to help residents here in Black Atlanta build wealth was one of the most powerful quotes I think we got out of kind of the conversations we had with community, really beginning to understand the need for the work that we're doing here at the Atlanta Wealth Building Initiative. And so as I mentioned, we have divided these into 4 buckets, our 18 recommendations, for it to be more digestible here. If you would like to see it in the full report, we kind of can grapple with it there. But so the first was to be meet basic needs and to build wealth and assets. And so some of those things are going to look like supporting a baby bonds program. And so baby bonds is a way to support and offset the negative impacts we know affects children born into poverty. With a small seed investment, a child born into poverty could have access to up to $25,000 or more, depending on the initial investment proposal by a city or state government to access once they turn 18 for wealth building prospects. So that looks like being able to pay for college. That looks like a down payment on a house. That looks like, being able to start a business. We also suggest that we could invest in a guaranteed income program. And so that means supporting individuals who are going to be at the margins there. And then lastly, we really want to talk about committing to more deeply affordable housing goals at the 30% area median income. And so what we'll see is that a lot of the housing developments that will come out will be at 80% of the area median income, which is still well above what we've seen to be the income for the majority of Black Atlantans. And so thinking about 30% of the AMI really gets back to that deeply affordable housing goals that we really want to push the government to push for. We could promote policies that support asset building for workers. And so that is things like repealing state preemption for minimum wage, paid leave, fair housing, and fair scheduling laws. But we also really want to make sure that in the city of Atlanta, where we're watching the boom in the movie industry and the tech industry and all of these outside companies and corporations coming in, that we're holding them accountable to all those goals in which they said they would do to create asset building jobs for the individuals here in Atlanta, right? So that doesn't mean, flying in talent, but actually hiring here, growing here, and investing in these communities here. And we would also really love to see the elimination of predatory lending. So as we mentioned in that piece of the access to capital, for those who do not have access to capital at traditional financial institutions, we'll see that they're often go to more predatory sources, which are charging them super high interest rates to access that capital, only further putting them in debt and reducing their wealth attainment. And so really advocating for a statewide policy that's going to reduce that predatory lending piece. We'd also really like to see the investment of equitable development and anti-displacement, right? So strengthening those commercial space opportunities in the city. As we talked about small business ownership and the revenues there, we begin to note as a city that we're losing core small businesses. People are getting priced out of their businesses once their developments are getting sold and things of like businesses are shutting down. Those businesses are assets to the community. We want to make sure that we can keep them here, especially also improve those barriers to entry and access for those small business owners who may be minorities. We want to prioritize inclusionary zoning and regulations with a racial equity lens. And we also want to increase transparency in the procurement outcomes of Black-owned businesses in the city. And so a huge part of what has helped the Black middle class grow here in Atlanta was Maynard Jackson's push to make sure that minority-owned businesses were involved in the contract of building Hartsfield-Jackson International Atlanta Airport as we know it today. And so really having some transparent understanding of making sure those small businesses can get contracts with the city, that indicates long-term revenue. And that also indicates that those businesses are now getting funding from reputable sources and making sure that the city is also investing in the businesses that are homegrown here. And then lastly, we want to bolster shared prosperity and reimagine the economy so it prioritizes community wealth. And so we've really looked at some innovative strategies when we're thinking about this that comes from property ownership, that's promote community land trust and commercial land trust. And it's the idea that communities can get together and purchase commercial properties, purchase a street of houses all together, and making sure that the wealth stays within that community and making sure that the businesses that are coming to that community are ones that residents would like to see and benefit the residents that are living there. We really love it if the city could codify a commitment to reparations and pursue policies that are reparative in nature, right? As we know, Atlanta is a huge site for civic action and historically Black civic action as well. And so really getting behind that movement would be huge for the city of Atlanta. And then lastly, we would really like for them to establish the Atlanta Office of Community Wealth Building. And so this office would be kind of a governing body and also one that has say in making sure that these institutions and these policies and these corporations that are coming in are really adhering to the guidelines that would really help the community build wealth in and of itself here in Atlanta. And so I have talked for some time, and so that's going to be kind of the full spiel today of our report. But this was an abbreviated version of what was shown in our report. And so if you would really love to engage more, and in fact, we would love it if you engaged more, you can scan the report here, and you can also go to buildblackwealth.info. That would allow you all to see the report in its full nature. There are also some interactive graphs there that allow you to interact with the material and data that was presented today. And please, as we have said, we'll answer questions shortly. So if you have any questions or any reactions to the information, please feel free to go ahead and drop that in the chat or in the Q&A section there. That would be really helpful for us. And the report has also been linked in the chat as well. So you can go ahead and click it at buildblackwealth.info. Also, the Atlanta Wealth Building Initiative just does not participate in policy building and policy advocacy. We're also really embedded in small community ownership and small businesses and making sure that they have the ability to succeed in the ways that they would like. And so we are announcing our Procure Forward program in 2024 with contracting. It's a contracting capacity development program. And so this program teaches participants, business serving organizations and their businesses the skills needed to grow your organization's procurement opportunities with corporations, government entities. So kind of like we mentioned earlier, really wanting to make sure that these businesses are primed to do business with the city because that is a guaranteed income and longstanding practice that would allow us to then infuse more income and more wealth into the Black-owned businesses that are here. So throughout the cohort, you'll be introduced to procurement professionals and and to supplement your advancement in this work. And so it will be launching on Friday, March 1st. So that's this Friday from 4 to 6. And so this is just going to be kind of like an informational call-in session. And so we would love if you all join to learn more about it. In the program, as we begin to get into the program, it will be weekly from 9 to 11 a.m. starting March 20th through June 11th. But again, this Friday is going to be an info session for that. So if you would like to scan the QR code, it should take you there. If not, again, it should be Procure Forward. And so the last kind of information I have for you all before I answer some questions is that we would love to stay connected. And so what I've posted here is going to be our socials. We'll have our Facebook, our LinkedIn, our Twitter, and then of course our website where you can reach us at the atlantawealthbuilding.org. So it's going to be atlantawealthbuilding.org. And yes, I will take questions now. So we do have one question here from Trisha Allen. The structural determinants of Black wealth You would love to reference this as part of my work in the economic. Yes, we would love to have you reference it as well. That would be amazing. And so if you go to the buildblackwealth.info, I believe there is a button at the top that allows you to engage with it more, so you can see it a little bit more zoomed in and spend some more time looking at it. But let me see, I believe I can probably go back to that slide so that we're able to engage with a little bit more, Trisha. And please feel free to connect with us as well. My email is going to be Jarryd, Jarryd, at atlantawealthbuilding.org. If you would like to spend some time engaging with our information there. It looks like we have another question around, are we still conducting interviews and research for this report? So this report has concluded. And so this report, Building Black Wealth and a framework for understanding wealth here in Atlanta has concluded. But what we are working on are a couple of different reports that are going to look at Atlanta as a city in the Southeast. I believe we're also doing some work in Savannah. And so if you're looking to be involved with us from a position of being a part of including this report and having your opinions heard, you can connect with us at info@atlantawealthbuilding.org, and we'll have the opportunity there to keep you abreast of any research studies we have coming out. And so we'd love for more resident participation. And that's coming from Andrea. So thank you so much for that question, Andrea. Okay, thank you. So in the chat, there's a question around how can an individual identify predatory lending practices? So when we begin to think about that, they're not always as clear, right? With the rise of digital technology and thinking about some of those digital kind of lenders that may be soliciting you through the internet. But a clear indication of that is if you're going to see very high percentage interest rates. So if you were looking at interest rates that are going to be really high, and they are going to seem to not be in line with the small amount you're asking. So you may be only asking for $1,000 and they're going to say, oh, we're charging you 25% interest. That's incredibly high, right? But we also want to talk about lenders who are going to be backed kind of by this central agency. So if we think about banks and the like, you'll see that they are insured by the FDIC if anything kind of goes wrong with your bank account. So we really want to push for being within more firm financial institutions there. Yes. Email my chat. Yes, I can post the email right now. So I posted those two there. And then how can an individual support the launch of a baby bonds program locally? So there is an organization called the Grow Fund who does incredible work kind of around understanding exactly what it looks like for a baby bonds pilot. And so we have not actually had a baby bonds pilot here in Georgia. I believe Connecticut and I believe it may be Massachusetts, are the two states that have passed legislation around baby bonds. And so really just making sure that you engage with organizations on the ground who are really advocating for this. And so if you think about, like I said, the Grow Fund, so that's going to be GRO, it's going to be the Georgia Resilience and Opportunity Fund. Engaging with them and making sure that we're supporting and lobbying your legislators for this policy to pass would be really helpful engaging with baby bonds. Benjamin Allen. Really good question. So what factors are considered in wealth? So I think, as we kind of talked about at the beginning of this, is that for Black folks here in Atlanta, wealth is going to be a much more dynamic set of inputs. I think, the typical idea of assets minus liabilities is kind of how we get wealth, right? We think about what is it that you have on hand and what is it that you are subtracting from your debt. And that really gives somebody the traditional version of wealth. I think when we really wanted to do this report here, we really wanted to orient ourselves to understanding what did wealth mean to Black people, and then the Black residents of Atlanta in particular. And so some of our inputs to understanding how to amass wealth are going to go beyond just that traditional definition. And so it's wonderful that I have this slide up here looking at the flowing river of intermediate determinants. And so one of the things that impedes people's wealth are going to be the freedom to access capital, the idea of not having asset creating jobs. So working a job that isn't going to give you healthcare or 401k that doesn't allow you to save in that manner. When we think about safe and affordable communities, right? So the idea of going into community and realizing that your house is being undervalued, even though it's the exact same home that have constructed on a side of town that has predominantly white population, are going to be things that go into the inputs of wealth. And so this report goes a little bit further than just thinking about what wealth is and kind of what are the things that are barriers to amassing that wealth. And so, the traditional pieces are going to be, like I said, it's going to be housing, it's going to be businesses, it's going to be 401ks and saving. Those are some of those traditional inputs that will be considered assets. But what are some of those things that are preventing us as Black folks and Black people in Atlanta in particular from being able to come further in that wealth journey? Thank you so much for that question, Benjamin. We also have here, how does AWI plan to act on these recommendations? And so when we think about acting on some of these recommendations, we're really engaging policymakers, nonprofits, and philanthropists with this report. And so this is really one avenue of doing so, right? Is making sure that we're engaging those individuals who have the power to do that change with the report and with the data, especially when we begin to think about how we've elevated some resident voices here. So these are solutions that are, of course, put together by us as policy analysts, but also really informed by what community members would like to see happen in their community. And so that's kind of one avenue. I think the other piece is making sure that we're getting this into the hands of the public as well. And so, you all being members of the community and coming to join today, we're really grateful because it means that you all are engaging with this information and not just, having it being talked about without you in that conversation. So really finding a way to engage you all in this conversation so that when it comes time to vote, when it comes time for that legislation to push through, there is a large support on the ground for understanding exactly the work that will benefit you in wealth creation. Mhm. Yeah. And then I believe we'll answer this last one here. How does an organization partner with AWI to join great forces in this work? So it would be amazing if you all would love to partner with us. So I've dropped my email in the chat. Feel free to email me. And we're always looking for partnerships that are aligned with our mission to kind of forward this work. And so we are in partnership as well with a lot of other individuals. So we'll think about the Growth Fund. We'll think about Invest Atlanta. We'll think about different organizations around the city who have that power to be an economic engine and change agent. Andrea has asked how long, oh, you don't see it in the chat. Gotcha. Here you are. That's my personal email, Andrea. And then this one here is going to be the larger info@atlantawealthbuilding.org if you'd like to be a part of any of our research studies coming up in the future. But she asked how long did it take us to put this report together? So this report has been the brainchild of the leader of our organization, Janelle Williams, as well as of the leader of the Policy and Research Department, Dr. Alice Carmardell. And so they've been kind of thinking about how this report looks since January of 2023. I think a lot of the legwork began somewhere around April, and then it got into full steam in June. So I'd say anywhere about 6 to 8 months to put this report together. And yes, there were a lot of inputs. I think one thing we found while creating this report was that there were a lot of barriers to accessing information. And so a lot of the stuff is not widely available at the city, state, or county level. And so it would take us some time to begin to piece together some of the data so that we're able to actually answer this question because it's not widely tracked. And so one of the recommendations is actually around democratizing data so that people are able to access it more often. We have here, how does AWBI construction program interact with the existing minority business enterprises and diversity in Atlanta? That's a really good question. And so what we're finding is that if you're getting MBE status and certification, those individuals are facing particular barriers around certification, around the application, and making sure that they're able to understand having all the paperwork they need and things of the like. This here does not necessarily register you for for a minority business enterprise status, but what it does do is it walks you through all the pieces and paperwork that you'll need in order to get into that pipeline. And so this, I will also say that this is not my area of expertise. That's a lot more on the programmatic side. I work on the policy and research side, but if you're wanting to know more about that, I would really encourage you to attend the info session on Friday. That would be really great. Another question here from Benjamin Allen. Wasn't clear about the procurement contracting event. Is it for established businesses or individuals who might be able to build a business? I'm particularly interested in helping businesses using my skill set. So from my understanding, it is for individuals who already have established businesses. And so yes, it's for individuals with established businesses. And so if you're interested in helping and connecting, I would encourage you to once again kind of reach out. We could always use more support. Yes, please post link for Friday's info session. Yes. And so I will ask one of my teammates if you guys could drop the link in the chat for the info session that's going to be occurring on Friday. But if you would love to get involved, again, we're always looking for partners who are mission aligned and wanting to help us kind of drive our initiative forward. So please get in contact with us if you'd love to help. All right. Well, you all, we have about 9 minutes left in the session. So if you have any more questions, I'm here to answer them. If not, I hope that you all have learned something today that you can use to take back to your communities and back to your organizations and making sure that you are sharing this information wide and far. But thank you all so much for attending today. I really appreciate you all hopping on and listening and learning from me today. And we look forward to conducting more of these.